Welcome to Lead Pods, the official leadership podcast from USMB for pastors and church leaders, where our goal is to increase our impact together.
Greetings, one and all, and welcome to another episode of the USMB Lead Pods. My name is Matt Ersman, and I'm excited to be your host today for a conversation that I think you are going to find to be very interesting. Today, we are joined by my friend and my coworker, Kyle Goings. He is the youth pastor at the church that I work at, and he also does a lot of work with USMB youth. Great guy. He's done a ton of research on today's topic, and I think you're going to really enjoy Kyle and all that we have to share with you today. So I think one of those things that a lot of us are really fascinated by is generations and some of the defining characteristics and the different ways that different people of various ages act differently because of the way they were raised or some of the cultural things that they were raised in and how that affects them. It's just a really interesting topic, and it's just true that if you put people in a room and they come from different generations, different backgrounds, they're going to view the world differently, and that has an effect on how they view church and how they view God. And I think it's a valuable conversation for leaders in the church to be aware of those things. So it's a fun conversation I think you're going to enjoy today. We spent most of our time kind of focusing in specifically on Millennials and Gen Z. Those are the two generations of kind of emerging young adults. And Kyle's got some really interesting data to tell you about those two generations. And, hey, I'll tell you up front, I am a millennial, and I want to make it clear, I have a job, I do not live in my parents' basement, and I do not believe that the earth is flat. There are a lot of stereotypes about millennials, and Gen Z for that matter, and we talk about those a little bit with Kyle today, but more importantly, again, we just want to highlight some of the major differences between the generations so it can hopefully be helpful for your church and for your leadership. So I do want to warn you, Kyle and I are friends, we joke back and forth, and I gave him a hard time on the podcast, and you're about to find out, Kyle can sometimes speak quickly. He likes to throw out a lot of stats and numbers, which are very helpful, but I'm just giving you a heads up that this is a very packed episode. There's a lot to cover, and we try to do it quickly, but just brace yourself because it's a lot of data that's going to be coming your way here shortly. So we'll take a quick break for a word from our sponsor and get right to a really fun conversation with Kyle Goings.
Deciding on the right college is a big deal. At Fresno Pacific University, we get it. We're a private nonprofit Christian university where your academic success is our priority. Our Mennonite Brethren roots run deep, from the classroom to the field. Professors connect you to research and internships. Financial aid makes your education affordable. And with our 4-year guarantee, you'll graduate on time to launch your career.
All right, my friends, well, we're excited for another episode. Today, we are talking to a friend of mine, Kyle Goings. And just a funny little peek behind the curtain for those of you listening. So Kyle and I actually work together. We are both at First MB in Wichita.
Yep.
We're currently on a Zoom call, even though we're probably like 20 feet from each other because, we're doing social distancing and being safe, and this kind of the best way to record through Zoom here. But so Kyle, greetings from down the hall.
Yes. Good to see you again.
So Kyle, probably a lot of people know you or they've seen your name through MB circle stuff, but if people don't know you, who are you, Kyle, and what do you do?
Kyle Goings. I am a full-time student ministry pastor at a church in Wichita, Kansas, an MB church in Kansas. Been here about 6 years. I was 8 years in the Central District in Rapid City, South Dakota. And since basically 2012, I've been the chairperson of USMB Youth, which is the national youth organization for MB churches in the United States. So I'm married, got 2 kids. That's basically me.
Well, I know today we're talking about a topic that you are very interested in. You've done a lot of research. It's something you talk about regularly. And so I know you're kind of one of the experts in this field. So we're talking about generations and kind of the differences between the different generations. And today we're specifically going to focus in on the younger generations that some church leaders might need to hear some information that you had to share. So again, you've done a bunch of research. Why don't you start us off? Like, why did you start this, Kyle? Like, why is this field, this study, something that you're so interested in?
Yeah, being a youth pastor and focusing on middle school and high school students, 3 years ago, I kind of did a self-assessment of the ministry and was very discouraged on how many high school students, when they graduate high school, it seems to me they're graduating their involvement in church. And so I was like, okay, why is that? And started reading some books and working on, is it discipleship, evangelism, denominational stuff? What is it? And I came across this generation studies on how generations are learning differently, hearing things differently, prioritizing differently. So 3 years ago, that started a journey that I have tried to read every book, listen to every podcast, watch every YouTube video about generations. And it's been very fascinating and kind of really changed how I've been programming ministry over the time. And so that's kind of the self-discovery 3 years ago of the importance of just different generations learning different ways, and how can the church change to adjust to that.
Gotcha. Cool. All right. Well, hey, let's jump right in. So tell us about the generations that are currently alive and give us, the name and maybe a couple defining characteristics of each of those generations.
Yeah, there's the silent generation. And so that's anyone born before 1945. And most generations are separated by what I would call as like unique influencers, as in there was an event that happened in the world that directed or impacted this generation. So we're talking about the Korean War, Cold War, that's the silent generation. Then you have the baby boomers, anyone born before 1964. You have the sexual revolution, JFK, Martin Luther King Jr., Watergate, all that. Then you have Generation X, or baby busters is what they call it, anyone born before 1981. The AIDS crisis, MTV started, the end of the Cold War was their kind of impactful influence. Then you have Generation Y, or what's called the millennials is their more popular term. And that's anyone born before 1995. And so 9/11 impacted them, the war on terror, the internet, social media started. And then you have the most current generation, Generation Z, or iGen, or Generation Zero. The terms change. But that's anyone born basically from 1996 to 2014. So YouTube started, globalization, mobile tech, that's kind of been influencing theirs. So what's interesting is 26% of the United States population is Gen Z and 25% is millennials. So 51% of the US population falls on these two most recent generations.
Yeah. Okay, we'll dive into those two specifically here in just a minute. But real quick, just for people, a little bit more context, can you give a rough age range of each of those groups?
So if you're 74 to 91 years old, you're in the silent generation. If you're 55 to 73 years old, you're kind of a baby boomer. If you're 40 to 54 years old, you fall into Gen X. If you are 24 to 39, you're a millennial. And if you're Gen Z, you are age 5 to 23. So you now are college graduates, is Gen Z starting to become and moving into the workforce.
Yeah. And I know there's been some interesting stats about how currently there are probably 4 generations in a lot of workplaces, right? Or
Yes.
4 churches. It's kind of a unique time where it's very possible that a 70-year-old is working with a 18-year-old, and that doesn't happen very often, but those people learn and communicate and live very differently, which I think is kind of a unique time for that to be happening.
And it's a positive strength where you can learn from different generations, but it's also a huge struggle on HR and conflict resolution people, because you have 4 generations for sure, because retirement age is increasing. And so more and more people are staying in the workforce as younger people are coming in. And it's drastically different thought process, way to communicate, priorities. It's an interesting time.
Yep. All right. Well, so today, that was really helpful context, but we're going to dive a little bit deeper and kind of focus on millennials and Gen Z now. So for a lot of people, they see things that are happening with millennials and Gen Z, and they just don't understand because their world is just different from the way that they were raised. And so one of our goals today is just to kind of help lift some of that confusion and explain some things that are important to those generations. And I also want to hear you talk about the difference between millennials and Gen Z, because they actually are pretty different. They have different things that drive them. So real quick, why don't you give us kind of a little bit more of an in-depth study of millennials and Gen Z and how they're different?
Yeah. So, and we're just going to give you the Cliff Notes version because it's crazy amount of differences that they both have, and that we're speaking in generalities when we speak about generations. So you might not individually fall into this category of this characteristic, but generally speaking, I should say, this tends to happen. So millennials are what's called digital savvy. I think this is the biggest one. They learn to adapt technology. They learn to be on social media. Gen Z are digital natives, as in they've never grown up in a world without computers, without cell phone, without social media, really. So they are just naturally involved in the digital world. Like a statistic that is interesting, the average teenager now spends 6 to 8 hours a day on their phone. Doesn't matter school, doesn't matter if the Saturdays, whatever. And so I like the term, I didn't come up with it, but I like the term screenagers. So they're very digitally savvy and native in that. Two, they are both extremely diverse. So women have more roles and leads in media, in workforce and all that, but they're also very diverse racially. 1 in 6 marriages are interracial couples now in the United States. So what's interesting is they're so diverse, particularly Gen Z, they're so diverse, it's normal that they only notice it when diversity isn't around, or when they're entering a building or a group or church or whatever that isn't diverse. That's the only time when they notice that it isn't diverse, because they're so used to being diverse. Number 3, they're obsessed with kind of creating their own brand. It's kind of part of an identity process. Before, you could find your identity as part of your family or part of your community. Now it's what you project to the world, whether it's online social media or it's how you communicate. And people are now coming their own brand as part of their identity. So they have a very complex relationship with social media. They're trying to find the right balance of fitting in and yet still standing out at the same time. And it's very complicated and crazy. They're trying to engage in the present, but yet still preparing for the future. And so they live in a world that tries to be very intentional on how they project who they are or their own brand. These people, probably the biggest factor that most churches will need to be aware of is that, especially for millennials, 39% are nones, as in N-O-N-E-S, no religious affiliation whatsoever. So almost 40% of people have no religious affiliation. It's not like they connected or they're somewhat Christian or Christmas or Easter Christians. They just have no religious affiliation whatsoever. The sad part is 60% of that 39% are from Bible-believing churches, Christians. So it's not like they never experienced religion or didn't grow up with no religion. It's that they're done. So they're nuns and duns. They came from Bible-believing Christians. Gen Z, they're noticing that they're a little bit more open to spirituality, and they're a little bit more open to Christianity in general in that, but they're not open to organized churches or religion as much as a relationship with Jesus. So there's some positive and negative to that, but majority of millennials are moving to the direction that there's going to be no religious affiliation whatsoever. So that's probably the biggest indicator, some characteristics on that.
What do you, in your research or maybe just in your work with students, why do you think that is? Like, why has that shift happened relatively quickly? I know is it just that they're raised in a world post 9/11 where the world's just a little bit more chaotic? How do you explain that kind of drastic turn?
There's a lot to that. I mean, there's a whole so much that it's almost could be in a whole nother podcast. I think there's a wide variety of factors. One of them, it is a snowball effect. If you grew up in a home where there's no religious affiliation and your family doesn't go to church, it's not like you're going to look to the church when you're an adult and you have your own family to raise it. So some of this is previous generations not having religious affiliation. In fact, each generation is less and less Christian than the generation before, since we started studying generations. Some of that is a snowball effect, is that more people are not growing up with Christian influence or even a Christian option. 2, I think truth is relative. And so absolutes is not very appealing as it once was. And Christianity isn't absolute. The only way to heaven is through Jesus and a relationship with Jesus. And there's parent involvement, there's society involvement, there's technology, there's unlimited access to a wide variety of so-called truth out there, but yet it falls under the category of fake news or just flat out lies. So there's a wide variety of stuff, and we can get into that a little bit more later on. But yeah, absolutely. There's so many factors that it's not just one thing that all we need to do is just change with one thing and the trend will change.
So I want to hear your thoughts. And again, I know your thoughts a little bit since we worked together, but you and I are both millennials. And
Yes.
I have to throw you under the bus just briefly,
Oh yeah, go ahead.
You really enjoy kind of talking some smack about millennials, and you just conveniently leave out the fact that you are a millennial. But that's kind of the joke of the culture, right? Is millennials are lazy, they're entitled. There's this picture in people's heads that they're 35-year-olds living in their parents' basement. They don't pay for anything. They don't have
No job.
no job. They're not getting married. They're not having kids. They're delaying adulthood, and they're just lazy, entitled young adults. Like that's kind of the stereotype that I think our culture has of millennials specifically. Well, first of all, where does that come from? Do you think it's true?
Yeah, so I'm one of the oldest millennials because I was born in '82, so I barely hit the boundary, if you will. But what's interesting is the main complaints or criticism that millennials receive is from other millennials. And so millennials is one of the few generations that have actually split into two different categories or subcategories. One is that me millennial, it's all about me, laziness, all that. There are some people who have that, or they're delaying responsibility because how parents were raised is that they all got trophies for winning or just participating and all that. And then there's the mega millennials, which is they're more like Gen Xers, very down to earth, getting a job right away, want to be self-independent and all that. So mega millennials cannot stand me millennials because they give all millennials a bad rap. And me millennials are not all bad. It's just, again, different priorities, different ways of how they interact with the world. Mm-hmm. And so some of the difference between millennials and Gen Z really impact that. So here's what I would say is that each generation impacts the next generation. So baby boomers are the parents of millennials. Gen Xers are the parents of Gen Z. And there's a huge difference between baby boomers and Gen Xers. And so how they're raised affects how they're going to interact. So a great example is millennials are way more collaborative. They want to have group work. Their school system focused on group work a lot. And so that's how they want to interact. That's how they process problems, ideas, is let's all put everyone in the same room and let's work it out together. Gen Zs are all about independent and they want to be successful on their own merits. So it's not that they don't want group work, it's that there's a time for group work, but when it comes really down to it, I want to make sure I can do it on my own. And so individual work is a big priority for Gen Zers that millennials just don't have. The other thing that I think separates that, millennials are idealists. Their parents, raised by boomers, okay, they were raised with great optimism. You can do anything you put your mind to it. You're all winners. And look, that sounds really bad. I'm not trying to have a tone, but that really affects their outcome on the future and expectations on authority figures, expectations on government, expectations on church, all that. Gen Zers, on the other hand, they are realists. So idealists versus a realist, and they just want the basic facts, and they are very self-aware. In fact, I think they're the most self-aware generation. And so they realize this is what I don't want. This is what I want. Just give me the basic facts. Another one is kind of millennials seek authenticity in their relationships, in their bosses, in their coworkers. Everyone needs to be open. Everyone needs to be authentic. It's one of the reasons why social media has been taken over by millennials is because they can be real, honest, and open to everyone all at the same time, which isn't always a good thing. There's some dangers in that, but it is a good thing to be authentic. Gen Z, however, focus on intentionality. They value time more than anything else because their choice overload, they have access to everything and everyone all at once. So the only thing that limits them is their time. So they're very cautious on how they spend their time. When millennials, it's very relationship oriented. So sometimes Gen Zers are like, I'm just going to do my own work or be alone at this time just because I don't have time to dedicate to that. And the last one, and this kind of I can see are getting in a political realm, so I'm not trying to, but how each respond to safety, the value of being safe. So millennials expect others or authority figures to make sure their organization, their government, their state is safe. They have these higher expectations on authority figures, particularly in government or bosses, to create a safe environment so they can work collaborative. Gen Z, They didn't grow up in this world of safe. They grew up with war on terror. They grew up with understanding the Great Recession and all that, even though they don't fully experience it because it was before them. So they grew up saying we should value not being dependent on someone else. So they have this entrepreneurial spirit that if they're going to find a career, they're going to invent an app or they're going to do something on their own and not just be in the system. But at the same time, what they found, especially in the workforce, is Gen Z would pick a job that has less prestige and less salary if it has better benefits. Millennial would always about prestige, making an impact, or salary. They didn't really care much about benefits. Not that they don't care, it's just it's less priority. So that's how the difference they are with millennials and Gen Z is kind of usually how they respond to the world and particularly the future.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's all super interesting and helpful.
It's a crash course. I get it.
It is. And we're going fast. So I hope people are keeping up with us, but it's all super interesting. It's true of every generation, right? Every generation has really positive characteristics and then maybe some things that are maybe a little bit more negative or things that are more difficult for other generations to understand. And so as you see it, we've talked about it a little bit, but you hear about how like anxiety and depression, it seems to be elevated in these younger generations. And again, maybe the entitlement thing, the social media stuff. So as in your studies and in your practice, what are some like really positive characteristics? And then what are some of the things that you see as being maybe more negative or challenging that these generations might need to be aware of?
Kind of some of the biggest facing issues, if you will, that Gen Z and millennials face, most of them overlap. So these two generations you can lump into it. Okay. Just because they're currently alive at the same time. Right. But how they respond is where they differ. So if you kind of picture a triangle or a pyramid in your head, and there's different layers. There's that base layer that affects something, and on top of that affects this and so forth, going all the way up to the top. So let me kind of build this, and this is kind of why things happen, or why do people respond the way they do, and it affects, it kind of answers your question on what are some issues. So let me kind of break it down. The bottom layer, the biggest layer on this pyramid, is they would say truth is relative. If truth is relative, there's not a lot of things to stand on. You can no longer say the Bible told me so as an authoritative statement, because they don't even acknowledge that the Bible's authority at all. So if there is no biblical authority, there is no absolutes in that. That means gender and sexuality is fluid. That means identity issues is a big problem because everyone has a harder time to figure out who they are. And they're forming their identity based on how people respond to them rather than internal factors on who they are really. Because truth is relative, it affects experience as value. So if truth is relative, the only indication on if something is true or not, particularly for millennials and Gen Z now, is what they can experience. Not what you tell me, not what can be proven by a textbook, not what can be proven by even the basic laws of physics, all right? But what can I experience? I was reading an article the other day, and it was a business article, and they say 33% of millennials believe in flat Earth, all right? And it's because they can't experience a round Earth. Now, I think that's absolutely ridiculous, and I apologize if you're one of the flat earthers out there listening. But what's fascinating is experience is now the only gateway on what is true or what is important or what is real. So if they can't experience it, they're not going to believe that it's true. The third level is belonging is desired. They want to belong to a group, whatever that is. So they're going to go and be accepted by whatever group accepts them the most. And they're constantly looking for that. If they're constantly looking to belong, the next level up there, the fourth level, is anxiety. They are overwhelmed with anxiety because remember, truth is relative. They have to experience everything, and they don't want to miss out on anything because they have to experience it to determine if it's real. And they want to belong to everyone and everything. And so they're constantly full of anxiety and testing. They can't stand on anything because everything is up in the air. So suicide is as an all-time high, and COVID has just put gasoline on the fire in suicide rates in this country. And the last level, the end result, is kind of identity crisis. They don't know who they are, and they're seeking purpose. So great example is this. Millennials were greatly impacted by 9/11, all right? 9/11 shook their world. Everything that they thought was trustworthy is gone. So before then, America naively believed that we were winners for everything, that we never were defeated in a war, that we're totally safe. And now something happened on our home turf. And that never happened before, really, in this world. So what followed that just 7 years later was the Great Recession. So now their financial institutions is no longer dependable. So this belief or this trust in higher authority, government, whatever, that's all taken away. And they're reeling from, they don't know how to necessarily handle that, because what else could they trust in order to provide a safe and authentic environment? Gen Z, they grew up with that as a default. That wasn't, they didn't newly experience that. There was never a time where there was not a war on terror. There was never a time in their life where they didn't have regular school shootings. There was never a time where they can remember that there wasn't race problems in this country. And then COVID was added on top of that. And they're actually probably the best generation to adjust to COVID than any of the others, because they're so used to not living in a safe environment. So the value of being safe wasn't as prevalent with Gen Z, and they acted out in a different way. The sad part is each of these generations are not looking to the church for safety. In past generations, you would. And I don't know if that's church because we haven't provided a safe environment for them. We haven't acknowledged or invited them that this is a safe place. But I think that's part of the issue that they're dealing with, is they're not looking to the church for those answers in dealing with identity crisis and anxiety and all those things. Anxiety and mental illness is an all-time high problem. The number one cause of death for teenagers is car accidents. That's not surprising, right? If you take away cell phones, it drastically decreases, but we won't get into that. The number two cause of death is suicide. From age basically 12 to 24-year-olds, Gen Z, the second cause of death is suicide. That breaks my heart. And one of my opinions, and this is just my opinion, I don't have necessarily all the data or facts to back this up, is I think psychology has replaced theology. In the message of religion, okay, they form identity, and you talk about who you are in Christ and all that. In psychology, it's almost a bottomless pit of who you are, why am I here? So psychology is not bad. I don't think that we should run from psychology and not be a part of psychology or medication or anything like that. I think that definitely has its place. But how do you know when you are healthy in psychology? When you stop going to a counselor. So that's when you determine if you're healthy enough. But if you look at religion and you look at Christianity and you look at scripture, there's never a time where you're not a sinner. There's never a time where you're not broken. You're constantly needing a savior every day of your life and turning to God in trust. But psychology says, no, you just go to counseling for a year or two, you take this medication, and then you're healthy, and then you're ready to go. And that need to seek out a savior and looking for God to help you find your identity, I think that these two generations don't look to Christianity, don't look to the church for that. And that doesn't even include the choice overload as another problem. Right. I mean, if you have choice overload and you can do 30 things at once all at the same time, and church is just one of 30 things, then yeah, that's going to be hard to choose that. I mean, they're going to figure out, okay, I can do church in a different way, and I don't necessarily need to be part of a community, especially Gen Zers. So those are just some crazy things that are issues that these generations are facing.
So I want to kind of wrap up our time in just a couple minutes about talking about churches specifically and what church leaders can do. But before then, okay, so far, I feel like we're painting a very bleak picture. I'm depressed. And for the record, you and I are millennials and we do not believe in flat earth. I mean, at least me. I don't know about you, Kyle.
I agree.
I want to set the record straight. We are not flat earthers, but so okay, we just went through a lot of the negative things, right? But what about these two generations gives you a little bit of hope? Like there's some good things too, right?
Yeah, so I think we need to change our mindset. I'm sharing some bleak stuff that older generations would be like, this is terrible. We got no hope. We should shut our doors down. But sometimes it's good to share the reality of what they're struggling with and what they're dealing with on a daily basis so the church can provide a more accurate, or I would say more intentional help. So the older generations, Gen X, baby boomers, silent generation, all that, you need to treat that as if you're a farmer, you're growing crops of corn, all right? There's certain equipment you do, there's certain seasons, you can switch it to maybe soybeans or wheat. And for the most part, it's the same field. For the most part, it's the same equipment. Millennials and Gen Z are like a crop of grapes. It's completely different. There's more intentionality. There's timer. It's a different season, different equipment. You cannot minister to the older generations and millennials and Gen Z the same way. But here's the best part. they're going to be awesome when they're on fire. So if you get a millennial or a Gen Z excited for your church, excited for Jesus, everyone in their life is going to know it, because they're going to be a walking billboard, digitally and in person, on that. And it's not going to be a private thing. Like in the past, generations tend to go to church. It's a cultural thing, but evangelism isn't as prevalent, and being very open on social media or whatnot of your spiritual life isn't there. But not with millennials and Gen Z. Everything's open. So you get a passionate, on board Gen Z or millennial, man, they're going to be a walking billboard. The other thing is, there is some resilient disciples. David Kinneam, he runs Barna. He calls it resilient disciples, as in about 10% of Gen Z particularly are people like Daniel in the Old Testament, that no matter the circumstances around them, they're going to remain faithful, they're going to make an impact, and those people are going to be on fire, and they'll be great leaders. They also have an entrepreneurial spirit. So if you give them a problem, you don't have to hold their hand to solve it. They'll figure out ways to solve it, and I guarantee you they'll figure out ways to solve it in a cheaper manner. Like, they're not ready to just blow their whole budget. They're very, especially Gen Zers, very financially, I would say, conservative in that. So getting a young Gen Z on your stewardship board or your finance team will actually help you. It seems backwards and a little nervous, but they're actually very good at handling their own money. They have to, because they grew up in the Great Recession. They're also very racially diverse. So if you get some Gen Z or some millennials in your church, they're going to bring diverse friends. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's a really good thing. And you don't really have to do or change much. You just have to move forward in that. So when they speak of the gospel, or when they evangelize to people, it is more about relationship with Jesus, purpose. It's more about the journey rather than it is a single event, as in I need to be saved and that's it. So churches getting or putting millennials and Gen Z, particularly in the church, in leadership positions, that's just going to naturally improve to collect or attract more millennials and Gen Z. This is a wonderful time to live, and it feels like scary, and it's only scary because it's so different. It's so different how they communicate, how they think, how they prioritize, but it's not bad. It's just different.
Yeah.
And it's so different, it feels like a whiplash, like I'm so overwhelmed. And so I tell pastors all the time, what do I do? How do I connect with other millennials and Gen Z? As I say, you need to become a cultural missionary. Get on apps like TikTok and Snapchat and all that, so you can make your own brand. You don't even have to post anything on it, but get on there to see what people are dealing with on a daily basis. If they spend 6 to 8 hours on their phone a day, that pastor, that ministry leader needs to be on the phone, not that much, but at least it needs to see what they're experiencing in order to even communicate. A missionary who goes to a foreign country, they learn the language, they learn the culture, they learn how they dress, they learn how they eat. Pastors need to be more of a missional mindset, or a cultural missionary, if you will, just to kind of understand that. They don't have to relate, they just have to understand, or at least can hear what they're seeing or hear what they're doing.
Yeah, that's perfect transition. So as we kind of start to wrap up here, most people listening, whether they're on staff or not, there's some kind of church leader. Most people are church leaders listening. So other than spending time on their phone, maybe downloading TikTok for the first time, what other things can churches do, especially if they look around and they notice that there aren't very many young people in their churches, which is increasingly, unfortunately, true for a lot of churches. So a church leader's listening, and they genuinely want to reach these younger two generations. What are some red flags about their current church that maybe they need to look for? And what else can they do to help bridge that gap?
This is kind of the sensitive time, because I am not trying to criticize any one particular church or any one way of doing things. So this is more, if ideally it all works out, they have the budget, they have the time, they have the leaders and resources in this. Maybe you do have to change the church, but maybe you don't have to change radically everything. You have to eliminate all the staff, all that. It might be a few tiny changes. So here's what I would start off kind of small. One of them, I would say particularly millennials, is prioritize your kids' ministry publicly. Putting money, time, resources, staff involved in your kids' ministry is going to help, because millennials are going to choose a church not based on the sermon, not based on if they completely like it or feel accepted, but also maybe even more how good their kids' ministry is. James Emery White, he writes Meet Gen Z and a bunch of other books. He basically says, you can blow it in the service, but have a stellar kids ministry, and that family still could come back. But if you have a stellar service and everything goes right and you blow it in kids ministry, they're not coming back for sure. So I would say focus on kids ministry. The other thing I would say, and this is radical, is stop having high schoolers in their own Sunday school class on Sunday mornings. By the time a high schooler is in high school, they need to be interacting with other generations. They need to have ownership of the church. They need to serve somewhere in that church. They need to be intermixing with other generations in their Sunday school classes. But middle school is okay, but high school, what they're noticing is a 5-to-1 ratio is what they say. A high school student needs to have 5 Christian adults pouring into them in order for them to guarantee or higher probability of them keeping their faith after high school. So if you keep separating them for a high school Sunday school class, it's one of the big things that by the time they graduate, they didn't never really experience the rest of the church. Maybe they didn't even go to the worship service because your Sunday school hour is the same time as your worship service. So I'm not against Sunday school, but high school Sunday school particularly is one of those, probably a harder pill to swallow. I also say kind of change maybe their language. Maybe they're a little bit more into the Christianese or denominational terms. Do they still call rooms parlor, tabernacle? They use words like sanctification. If you are a nun and you have no religious affiliation, those are overwhelming. It's kind of like if you're an engineer and a friend or someone who doesn't know you comes up to you and you say, what do you do? Well, I'm an engineer. Okay, what does that mean? You're going to use non-engineer terms to describe your job because that's easier for them to understand. We need to have that intentionality when it comes to the church. So James Emery White also says you need to have an Acts 17 mindset versus an Acts 2. So in Acts 2, you see Peter, after the Holy Spirit comes, gives a great message, but it's to God-fearing Jews. He didn't have to prove that there actually was a God because they all believed in God. He was talking about Jesus. In Acts chapter 17, Paul is talking to Greeks. They don't know God and they're Gentiles. And so he uses a statue. Hey, you have the statue labeled as an unknown God. Let me tell you about that. And he used their culture. So talking to Acts 17 kind of mindset is a little bit different than Acts 2. And so that's what I would say is churches need to learn that intentionality. And Gen Z, they love to communicate, but more and more Gen Z love to communicate not using words, using graphics, pictures. That is a big thing. So very word heavy social media posts is not going to be as attractive to Gen Zs because they'll skip or scroll by, and pictures is what they'll stop. So that's just a few of the things I would say that maybe churches need to kind of address. Even how they communicate the gospel message is another one that I'm thinking of. Millennials are raised with great optimism. They don't really need a savior because everything's a winner and participation trophies and everything else. So their gospel message of, hey, you're a terrible sinner and you need Jesus, that is true, but it's not going to be an easy pill for them to swallow. It's easier to say, hey, when you become a Christian and you start following Jesus, you're now giving a divine purpose. And you focus and communicate, especially the first conversation, about the journey, rather than you need to make this hard-nosed decision right now because you're a terrible person. They would not even acknowledge that they are a terrible person because, again, truth is relative. So who are you to say that I'm a terrible person? The other thing is Gen Z, they have a bad reputation saying that they have an 8-second attention span. Mm-hmm. They actually don't have an 8-second attention span. They have an 8-second filter. Their life is so open and they have so much choice overload and access to everything. They're going to look at something, especially on social media, that if it doesn't attract them or catch their eye in 8 seconds, they're going to move on because they have more opportunities to do that. So how churches project to the world, their stage design and their stage decor matters to Gen Z. How your stage looks matters. It shouldn't have to, but it does to them. So if you come across as very traditional, very old, and very wood oriented, they're going to automatically judge on that. And that doesn't mean it's bad. It doesn't mean you have terrible messages or terrible worship. It means that visual is like, I don't know if I'm going to give that church a chance. It's not about getting all kinds of lights and electronics everywhere. Maybe just a dark black stage that's clean. Maybe that's it. But visual kind of things is a big factor to Gen Z. And the last thing I would say, and this is hard for people to understand, the sermon is no longer the hero of the worship service to millennials and Gen Z. They're not going for the sermon as the highest priority anymore. Older generations, that was a crucial fact. In fact, an older generation would say, if you go to church, you worship, you hear announcements, you pray, and you go home and you don't hear a sermon, it's not really church. Millennials and Gen Z don't believe that. In fact, the sermon is fine, but they can get a sermon on YouTube or on their phone at any time, and they're really good sermons and really good messages. So what is attracting millennials and Gen Z is that experience or movement of the Holy Spirit that they can only get at church. This experiencing God in a way that they can't get just by studying alone on their phones or listening to a YouTube video. But there's that movement that happens when we worship. And it's one of the reasons why charismatic churches are actually growing with millennials and Gen Z, because they can tangible, or what they would say, tangibly experience the Holy Spirit or experience God, when more traditional churches are struggling a little bit more. And it doesn't mean we need to be more charismatic. It just means, why does the Holy Spirit move at church? Why is God so inclined that you need to assemble as a body of believers? And I think there's multiple layers of that. And the more you can project to that, whether in person or online, the more you're going to attract millennials versus just, let's just have a great sermon and everything else can be second rate.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily encouraging, but it is doable.
Okay, we're wrapping up here. We're at the end. I want to pause. Let's take a deep breath. If I were to take today's transcript of every word that was spoken, I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's probably 2 or 3 times more words than usual. Kyle, you speak very fast. We covered a lot of ground today. We went through, decades and decades of generation study, lots of stats, lots of good news and bad news. It's going to be okay. I just feel like we covered a lot of ground so quickly. My brain is spinning, and I've heard a lot of this before, so I'm sure people might be feeling the whole fire hose thing. We covered a lot of ground. So especially if this has kind of resonated, if they feel like they want to learn more, I know you've done a ton of research, like we've said. What are some books or podcasts? What are some other resources you'd recommend for people to continue this study? Because like you said, we just scratched the surface.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a ton of podcasts and books and YouTube videos out there on generations. In fact, millennials and Gen Z are the most studied generations than ever before. Yep. So Barna, the Christian organization, has one of the best kind of databases of everything you could possibly think of. James Emery White, he writes this book, Meet Generation Z. It's one of the first Generation Z books out there. So I say that's required reading. Maybe a non-Christian book or a secular book would be Generation Z Unfiltered. But you also have books like Faith for Exiles, You Lost Me, Already Gone, a wide variety of books who do, basically they study millennials, Gen Zs, and sees how can this help the church. I also, it's a selfish plug, but I also did 2 video podcasts, if you will, based on this, part 1 and part 2, and you can find them at usmbyouth.com, and you can see on there, and there's resources, PowerPoint, stuff like that, because I'm not even an expert. I would just say I've studied this for years, and I'm still learning something every single day, so I'm constantly updating this content, and there's new stuff and new data coming out all the time. And right now, COVID is going to change everything on its head. And we don't even know the full effects of COVID until maybe even 2 years later on how this has impacted our generation. It is a generation defining moment. Yep. Like 9/11 with some millennials. And so we still don't even fully know the effects, but it's going to be okay. I believe the church will not crash, will not go down in flames. I believe millennials and Gen Z, they'll be concerned about the next generation, Generation Alpha, who's currently 5 years old now, on how different they are from them. This is a natural concern for each generation on how different they are from the next generation.
Yep.
But it's going to be okay.
I agree. And maybe it's just because, I'm in this group, but I see a lot of silver lining, a lot of hope for the future, especially coming out of this COVID season. I think the church is going to, I know the church will be just fine. And I think these young people are going to lead us into a new chapter of the church that I think will actually be really good and really healthy. So
a positive thing that I forgot to mention is there's going to be less cultural Christians in these 2 generations. Yep. And they're going to be more real, authentic, passionate Christians. So you're going to know it's going to be a little bit more black and white who's a follower of Jesus and who's not, versus who's culturally going to church in that.
Yep.
And so that's a positive thing, but it's not necessarily the easiest thing to see.
Phew. All right. Well, we did cover a lot of ground today. Kyle, thank you very much. I know you've done a ton of research, a lot of study, and I know you've done a lot obviously for our church here at First MB, but also for all the USMB churches, doing a lot of work with the youth. So thank you for all that you do. Thank you for your time today, Kyle. Really appreciate it, man.
Thank you.
The Center for Anabaptist Studies, offered through the Fresno Pacific Biblical Seminary, provides educational resources for pastors, congregations, and leaders to nourish an innovative demonstration of Anabaptist values. The center, also referred to as CABS or CABS, has been partnering with USMB to provide webinars addressing contemporary issues facing the church and Jesus followers today. Don't miss the next 4-part series of webinars focused on anti-racism beginning on September 1st. Visit the USMB website for more information or to register for the webinar series at www.usmb.org.
All right. Well, hey, my thanks again to Kyle for joining us today. And Kyle is a really great guy. I like to give him a hard time sometimes, but he is a great guy and he does a great job leading the youth at our church, and he takes this stuff very seriously, and he puts his money where his mouth is. He really did kind of blow up our youth ministry a couple years ago and shift how we were doing things in an effort to better reach Gen Z specifically and get them more involved in our church family. So shout out to Kyle, and thanks to him for all that he does for First MB, for USMB, and then for his help today with this really helpful information. So, and thanks again to you for listening today. I got quite a bit of really great feedback from our last episode where we talked about MB history, so thanks again to Peggy and Wendell for that. And if you missed that episode, I do encourage you to go back and listen to it. It was a fun one that really was helpful in establishing some background about the MBs and who we are, what we believe. So please go check out that episode if you haven't listened yet. And as always, we've got more coming your way soon, so please subscribe and keep on listening and help us spread the word so more and more people can hear this great content. So thanks again for listening today. I hope you're having a great day wherever you are, and we will see you next time on the Lead Pods.
Thanks for listening to Lead Pods. Make sure you don't miss an episode by subscribing to our show wherever you're listening today. Learn more by visiting usmb.org, and be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We'll see you next time as we learn more practical tools to increase our impact together.